I think it's going well. You know how I know it's going well? I know it's going well because I can feel, this is corny, all right? Brace yourselves. I can feel love in the room. I can. That feeling that you feel is people making new friends, coming together, and building an alliance that can win. Now, we need that alliance. And I'm not going to hide it from you. We need that alliance because we're in a tough spot. America's in a tough spot. The democratic world is in a tough spot. And let's be clear, what is that spot? On the one hand, in 2020, which is a watershed year in the history of the West, on the one hand, we got to see a rising China. We got to see it clearly, its ambitions, its intolerance, and its power. On the other hand, in 2020, we got to see something that I think none of us ever thought that we'd see in our lifetimes. Revolutionary, a cultural revolution, a neo-Marxist cultural revolution, which has taken over many, maybe most, of the liberal institutions that formed the backbone of liberal hegemony in the United States since after World War II. And that is a threat to the United States, and that is a threat to the entire democratic world. Now, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about what we got to do. And it is confusing. The situation's confusing. On the one hand, as conservatives, we know that we defeated something that looks a whole lot like this just a few years ago. In the 1960s, the United States and its allies were facing a rising communist threat abroad, rising socialism at home. And in fact, the contemporary conservative movement, the movement we call conservatism, in the United States and in Britain at least, that movement came together at that time. Bill Buckley, Frank Meyer, forged an alliance with Russell Kirk. That alliance, in the jargon of the conservative think tanks, was called fusionism. What was fused? What was being fused together? The formula that the fusionist conservatives came up with in the 1950s and 1960s was roughly this deal: a public liberalism, a private traditionalism, a public liberalism, a private conservatism. Right? We're going to support freedom, economic, social freedom, individual liberties everywhere we can, almost across the boards. And in exchange, we're going to be emphasizing traditionalism, nation, God, scripture, the traditional family at home. Now, this fusionism was immensely successful. This fusionism won the Cold War. This fusionism defeated the Soviet Union and rolled back socialism in American Britain. You can't argue with success. But this fusionism was also a failure. And today we have to understand, if we're going to be able to go forward and defeat our opponents, our rivals, our enemies of this moment, then we have to be able to see what went wrong. Because if we try to repeat the fusionism of the 1950s and 60s, it's going to be a disaster. It's going to fail. I want to tell you why. Because this idea of a public liberalism and a private conservatism didn't work. It didn't work. Over those decades, from the 1960s until now, until the 2010s, over those two generations, the private conservatism was affected by the public liberalism because there is no real separation. There's no wall separating the public from the private. That's a myth. And if you are talking about freedom, individual liberties only in the public sphere, and you're talking about Christianity, tradition, the Bible, God, family only in the private sphere, well, we got to see it. the private sphere withers away. It absorbs the public sphere, reaches down into the private. The federal government is liberal. It makes the states more liberal. The states make the schools more liberal, and the companies more liberal. Everybody ends up saying, well, what our country stands for is just individual liberty. I'm not here to knock individual liberty. Individual liberty is fantastic. Wouldn't want to live any other place than a country that cherishes individual liberty. But if you're only about that, take a look. What happens? Let's look at a couple of examples quick. If you're only about individual liberty, right, then you say, well, private corporations are deciding to offshore manufacturing to China, and they're building up China, and that's individual liberty. The government shouldn't do anything about that, a liberal will say. A liberal here defined as someone who believes that individual liberty is the beginning and the end, the alpha and the omega in politics. So you're offshoring your corporations, you're depopulating your homeland, your heartlands from manufacturing capacity, you're threatening your own ability to defend the country, but at the same time you're building up an enemy which has the capacities that you used to have. So if you're a little bit too far into liberalism, you'll say, well, it's a private company, they should be able to do what they want. A conservative will always say no. We're a nation. We need to be loyal to one another. There have to be limits to individual liberties when you reach the point that you're harming the public. This used to be, because some people call this the common good, but it's just as good to say the national interest, the public interest. There is such a thing as our country is in trouble because of this policy which is too liberal. Let me give you another example. All right, it's wonderful to have an economy that's capable of creating these vast tech corporations, changing our lives in bad ways and good ways, but it's exciting to watch. It's exciting to be part of it. I'll tell you a secret, I actually like Twitter. Look, all of us have our flaws, and I actually like Twitter. But the question is, individual liberty. Okay, so they built these corporations. They became extremely powerful and wealthy. Is there no limit? A conservative will say, of course there's a limit. Of course there's a limit. There is such a thing as a public interest. There is such a thing as a common good. If you get to the point that free speech, which is a key traditional value of the Anglo-American tradition and of this country, if you get to the point where freedom of speech is actually something that ceases to be possible in the country because you've given too much power to private corporations, then a conservative says, no, I'm not just about limiting government, I'm about limiting anything which gets so vast and so powerful that it starts harming the public in ways that are obvious. All right, so there's a difference between a liberal and a conservative. There is such a difference. Or to take another example, pornography. I have too many friends who call themselves conservatives, but really they're just liberals, who say, look, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. What difference does it make how people make money as long as the GDP is going up? And a conservative says, no, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? You have to be able to say, look, this is leading to the enslavement of young women and men, and it's corrupting all of us. A conservative has to be, look, a liberal will tell you, look, what difference does it make if it's a foreigner who's coming into our country and they can be part of our country, or somebody who's born here? Don't be a racist, don't be a nativist or whatever it is. Just let everybody immigrate. We need to be as big as China. Some people who call themselves conservatives say, let's get to 1 billion people so we can economically compete with China. Conservatives says, no, don't be crazy. There's something valuable in the history and the religion and the traditions of this nation. And immigration's all right as long as the people who are coming know that they're going to come and take up these traditions and become part of this country. Because lots and lots of... It is possible to bring in enough immigrants from a different culture so that your culture becomes their culture, or worse. enough immigrants from a foreign country so that you're in civil conflict. You're in civil war. That can actually happen. All right, so there's a difference between liberals and conservatives. They both have their place, but you probably guessed. I mean, I've never been a liberal in my life, not for 5 minutes. I mean, I was never tempted for a second to be a liberal, just so you know who you're dealing with. But there is a place for liberals and there's a place for conservatives. And we do have to say that in this tight spot where we face China abroad and neo-Marxism at home, in this tight spot, we're not going to make it through if there's no alliance between anti-Marxist liberals and hardcore, serious, real conservatives. We're not going to make it through without an alliance. Okay, but the alliance cannot be on the terms of the fusionism of the 1950s and 60s. It can't. It can't because conservatism is dying in this country, and it's dying because liberalism has taken over everything that used to be called conservative. We want to turn this around. We're going to have to turn it around. So it's complicated. We need to do two things at the same time. One, we need to learn again to distinguish between liberals and conservatives. There are people at this conference who are good friends of mine. They're anti-Marxist liberals. I'm not asking them to become me. I'm not asking them to become conservatives. I'm asking them and everyone here will distinguish between liberal and conservative again. We'll know that if somebody is telling us free market, that's the key to everything, then okay, they're a liberal. I have a lot of liberal friends. If somebody is telling us if you do not have religious and national traditions, then you're not going to have, well, you know what you're not going to have. You're not going to have fathers in the homes, and you're not going to have men marrying women, and they're not going to have children, and those marriages are not going to stay together. If you don't have God in Scripture in the schools, you're not going to get there. Okay. Eliminating God in Scripture in the schools, which is something that took place beginning in the 1940s, reached its critical point in the 1960s, that is the turning point in American civilization. And if you're a conservative, you know that. And if you're a conservative, then you say, above all else, we've got to get God in Scripture back into the schools. We can do it through charter schools, we can do it through vouchers, we can do it through public schools, we can do it any way we want, but we got to get God in Scripture back into the schools, because children who do not ever hear about God or the Bible during their education do not come out Christians, they do not come out Jews, they come out liberals, and liberals who are not Christian and not Jewish, it doesn't work. We've seen it, it doesn't work. All right, so I said we need to distinguish liberal from conservative again, just so we can think clearly. And once we make the distinction clear, then we need to turn around and say, you know what, there's a lot of good anti-Marxist liberals in this country. Maybe they want to be allies to national conservatives, to people who understand that nation and religion are cornerstones, and without them, we're through. Maybe there's going to be a big new alliance, but it's not going to be on the old terms. Okay, so I'm going to propose some terms. I'm going to propose something. We'll see what other people say. We'll see how many of the conservatives can handle it, how many of the anti-Marxist liberals can handle it. I say that the big mistake that we make when we say our country is going to be a liberal country, the big mistake that we make is that we think that everything can be equal to everything else. Now, let me rush to say that in some places, equality is so, the injustice is so burning and so immediate and so horrific that we've got to force equality. There are such places. I think America was right after World War II to say, you know, we just fought this war against the Nazis, the race tyrants, and we can't have racism against blacks in this country. I think that was right. I think that was the right thing to do. I think America had one job to do after World War II, and that was to end Jim Crow. That's the way I see it. Okay, so there are times when you say, look, the injustice is too great and we need equality. But the problem is that Americans, and with them the whole West, they didn't just say blacks should be equal to whites. They want to say everybody should be equal to everybody. Blacks should be equal to whites, men should be equal to women, foreigners should be equal to American citizens, and on and on. Then it gets to married people are equal to unmarried people. People who are heterosexual are equal to people who are homosexual. It goes on and on. You know where it's going. Look, I'm going to say something that's hard for people, but it's necessary to say it now. Okay, if you're 80% of the population and somebody else has a different view and they're 2% of the population, there's a limit to how much equality there can be between people who are 80% of the population, or a point of view that's 80% of the population, and people who are 2% of the population. Liberals find this difficult. Conservatives find this obvious. For a country to survive, it has to have a public culture. That public culture has to have norms, moral norms, political norms, the traditions of how we live here. Those are the guardrails that guide us. Our job is to hand it down from generation to generation, not just families, congregations, also the government. Our job is to hand down moral norms. When you take 80% of the population that's Christian, and you say there's 2% of the population that's atheist, I don't know what the numbers are now, and you say atheists are equal to Christians, our government has to be neutral between the 80% and the 2%, what you are doing is a crying injustice and something utterly imprudent and something that will destroy your country. All right, so I'm an Orthodox Jew. So let me start with me. Let me start with Jews. Jews are about 2% of the United States, and this is true in other Western countries, that there's small Jewish communities, thank God, that are safe and flourishing in various countries. Jews are 2% of the population. What do Jews need in this country? What Jews need in this country is a carve-out to be able to pursue their traditions, to send children to their schools, to not be persecuted, obviously not to be abused or killed. That's what Jews need. Do Jews need to clear the public space from Christianity? I say no. No, no. Jews do not need, in order to be safe in this country, to be free from the indignity of walking out into the public and seeing a Christmas tree or a nativity scene. We don't need anything like that. And I personally am exhausted from hearing, from talking to my liberal Jewish friends who say, well, everybody's going to be equal. They're saying that the 2% should be equal to the 80%, and then they think that that means that the country, the public sphere, and the schools, and the politicians, and the business, that everything should be cleared of anything that could be painful for them. Well, guess what? Being a Jew is painful, and it's not our job to clear the public of its norms. It's not. You choose to be a minority, that means that your life is just a little bit harder. I think being a Jew is worth it, all right? Okay, so let me now go to the, people will be mad enough about that. Let's make them even madder. If you're 2% of the population, now when I was in college, everybody told me gays are 2% of the population. They said it was hardwired, and they said there's nothing you can do about it, it's biological. And I and everybody else that I know said, I mean, like I said, I was never a liberal. I'm hard, serious conservative. But I thought, 2% of the population, what's the point of oppressing 2% of the population? Give them a carve out, give them some space so they can live their lives. I think almost everybody felt like that. Right? But now it's a long time later. You know, now it's a generation later. And Pew says under 30, 16% are identifying as LGBTQ. Well, first of all, just notice that whatever they told us, you know, 30 years ago about it's 2% of the population, it's hardwired, something has gone really wrong with that number. Now, I'm not arguing that that's not true. I have no idea. I don't know whether it's true or not that 2% of the population are genetically predisposed to be gay, but I do know that just like Judaism was used as an excuse to clear the public space of Christianity, now LGBTQ is being used as an excuse to clear the public space of things that are pro-traditional marriage, pro-traditional family, certainly Christianity, Bible, Judaism. I mean, all these things can just be driven from the public space because they can be offensive to, you know, to 2% of the population. And our principle should be this. Here's my proposal. We'll see if anybody wants to go for it. If there are 2% of biological gays in the population, that's enough. There should be a carve-out. Give them their privacy. Nobody wants to be arresting people in their bedrooms. Okay, but 2% of the population is not 80% of the population. And a country needs to have public norms. And the public norms of a country or at least those states that are left where is a majority of Christian, the public norms have to be Christian. And I'm talking the whole way. God and Scripture, a Christian moral life, Christian moral teachings, these things should be legitimate. It's a democracy. There's a majority, a large majority. It just has to go back to being legitimate. So we conservatives, I think that our position should be clear and simple. There is going to be a new deal, I hope, between conservatives, between national conservatives and traditionalists on the one hand, and anti-Marxist liberals on the other. What we say to anti-Marxist liberals is where there is a large Christian majority in a country that was and may someday again be a great Christian nation, where there is that, the public life of the country has to be Christian. It's only fair, it only makes sense. You're not going to replace Christianity with this vacuous, empty liberalism, which then immediately collapses into Marxism. We're not going to do that anymore. And the way that we're going to go forward with our friends, and you see here, I have liberal anti-Marxist friends who are here with us. They're great people. We're going to find a way to work with them, and this is my proposal. Where there's a majority of a certain culture, they get the public culture. What gays need, what Jews need, what any other minority small minority that you can name, what we need is carve out so we can live our lives freely. We do not need to twist the public culture of this nation into something that supposedly caters to us, but actually is only trying to destroy the culture of the majority. We're not going to do that anymore. So here is a conservatism that I think that traditionalists, religious conservatives, nationalist conservatives, together with their anti-Marxist liberal friends, this can work. Let's give it a try. Thank you.